I remember lying in bed that night, the room dimly lit by the soft glow of a street lamp filtering through my window. The air was still, heavy with the scent of rain on pavement. Outside, shadows moved strangely in the corner of my eye, shifting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, that it was just the fog settling over the city. But then the hum began, soft at first, almost like the vibration of my own heartbeat, then rising into a low, undulating pulse that seemed to wrap around the walls. Shapes formed in the darkness, tall and distorted, gliding effortlessly, yet impossibly, against the floor and ceiling. That's when I saw it, a dark, faceless figure hovering in the corner of the room, its edges rippling like water. I never should have opened my eyes fully. The fog pressed against my window tonight, thin and gray, crawling along the edges of the glass. I could smell damp asphalt, sharp and cold, carrying the faint taste of winter. The room was dim. A single lamp fought the dark, but only made the shadows longer. Corners I had walked past 1,000 times seemed different. I noticed one corner in particular. It felt heavier. Somehow, the shadows pooled there, deeper than the rest, curling against the walls like slow, pale smoke. A hum began, soft, almost imperceptible at first. It rose like breath through a tunnel, wrapping itself around my chest. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was a heater, the pipes, something ordinary. But the corner shifted, not with the light, not with the fog. It moved in a way that made my skin crawl, a soft, deliberate rustling, like silk brushing against stone. I stayed still, every muscle clenched. The hum pulsed now, a steady rhythm under my ribs. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, yet it filled the room so completely, I could feel it on my eyelids. I looked closer. The shadows seemed almost liquid, stretching toward me. A faint outline appeared. At first, I thought it was imagination. Then I saw it more clearly. There was a shape crouched in the corner, unmoving, watching. I couldn't breathe properly. The air felt thicker near it, heavier, colder. I could almost hear my own heartbeat over the hum, like it was counting each beat, dragging the silence out longer. I blinked, and it shifted again. Not walking, sliding, or maybe just extending. A hand, impossibly long and pale, reached along the floor, touching nothing, yet leaving a chill wherever it passed. I whispered to myself, though the words felt strange in the air. You're imagining it. It's just a shadow. The fog, the lamp, the quiet hum. But shadows don't reach. Not like that. I wanted to move, to run, to call out. My body stayed frozen. Soft footsteps would have sounded safer, somehow, but there were none. The hum changed tone, wavering, now a quiet moan that filled my ears. It wasn't coming from the corner. It was coming from inside me, a low, vibrating echo that pressed against my chest. The shape leaned closer, closer enough that the floorboards didn't creak. The air didn't stir, yet the space between us thickened, folding inward like smoke. I could see a shadowed face, the edges blurred and trembling. Its eyes, they weren't eyes, just darker hollows that drank the pale light. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something in that corner wanted me to see it. Time became slow, stretched. The fog pressed harder against the window. The lamp flickered. The hum lingered, a gentle vibration under my skin. Then stillness. The corner emptied. The shadows returned to their usual shape. The room smelled the same. The fog still drifted in. But I knew it hadn't left. It was waiting, patient, folded into the dark like a thought I couldn't quite remember. I stayed awake until the fog thinned. Every creak, every whisper wind made me tense. Every shadow seemed a little too long. By the time the first pale light of morning bled into the room, I almost believed it was gone. Almost. The corner remained, empty, but the hum, it lingered in my chest, soft and patient, as if it found a new home. And I realized I was not alone. The room smelled faintly of rain. The fog had thinned outside, leaving the street wet and dark. I could feel the chill creeping under the door, brushing my ankles. The lamp flickered, a small, uneven pulse of light, nothing mechanical, nothing I could explain. It made the walls breathe, slow and heavy, like the room had a heartbeat. I watched it closely. Each flicker stretched the shadows, bending them into shapes that didn't belong. A corner that had been empty moments before seemed to bow inward, folding itself in ways that hurt my eyes to notice. A soft hum rose in the air, not from the lamp, somewhere inside me, vibrating under my skin. I felt in my chest first, then in my temples, as if the room itself was breathing with me. At the edge of my vision, shapes appeared, impossible, half-formed, stretching, just beyond recognition. They moved when I wasn't looking, collapsing into walls, then reforming behind the curtains. I tried to focus on the lamp. Its light flickered again, faster this time, jagged and uneven. The shadows danced, like pale fingers reaching toward me. I could almost hear them, soft rustling, brushing, sighing against the floor. I leaned closer to the window. The street was empty. The fog was gone. Only the lamp remained, and the way it made the room impossible, pliable, alive. I blinked. A shadow shifted near the corner again, fluid, stretching across the wall. I couldn't tell where it started or ended. It was just there. I reached for the lamp, half hoping touching it would make it stop. My fingers brushed the metal, cold and solid. The flicker stuttered, but didn't end. The shapes in periphery only grew, bending further, elongating in slow, impossible movements. A breath passed my ear. Not mine. Soft, deliberate, almost questioning. I froze, pressed against the edge of my bed. The lamp stuttered again, and the shapes bent closer, just at the edge of light. Curiosity tugged me forward. I wanted to see it fully, to know what was making the shadows alive. But when I moved my head, the shapes recoiled, folding back into the darkness, leaving nothing but flicker and silence. The hum continued, gentle and insistent. It wrapped around the room, filling the space between the shadows, the lamp, and me. I realized then that the flicker wasn't random. It was alive in some way, responding to me, to my fear, to my gaze. Minutes passed, or hours, I couldn't tell. The lamp's light steadied, as if it decided I had seen enough. The shadows returned to ordinary angles. The shapes vanished from the edges of vision. I sat there, alone, feeling the hum recede into my chest. The fog was gone. The room was quiet. The lamp stood steady now, pale and unremarkable, as if it had never moved at all. But I knew better. Even in stillness, I could feel the shapes lingering, waiting for the next flicker, the next pause in light. And I understood, without thinking, that the room would never be empty again. I didn't sleep. I didn't even close my eyes. The lamp flickered once more, faintly, and I held my breath, listening to the quiet hum between the shadows. And I waited. The room smelled faintly of old wood, damp and dry at once, like the house itself was breathing. The fog had lifted outside, leaving only a pale streetlight bleeding through the window. The walls began to hum, soft at first, almost comforting, a low vibration that pressed against my bones, threading through the floor into my toes. I rested my hand on the wall. It shivered beneath my palm, gentle and strange, like it was alive. I could feel the hum in my fingertips, a pulse that didn't belong to me. Shadows moved differently tonight, not with the flicker of lamps or passing cars. They slid along the surfaces, stretching and curling in impossible ways. Corners that had always been sharp and still now bowed under their weight. I listened. The hum rose slightly, wrapping around the room, touching the ceiling, settling in the corners. Every breath I took made it throb in my chest. I felt as though the walls were whispering secrets I could almost understand. The air thickened. Every inhale tasted faintly metallic, like rust and rain combined. It clung to my skin, dampening the hair on my arms, settling in my lungs with soft insistence. I tried to leave, but my feet felt rooted. Soft footsteps, almost my own, echoed somewhere just beyond the room. No doors opened. No floorboards creaked. Yet the sound was there, brushing along the edges of perception. A shadow leaned along the far wall. I couldn't tell if it was one or many. It slid upward slowly, stretching into the ceiling, bending reality at the edges of my sight. I felt its gaze without seeing eyes, a pressure that made my breath shallow. I pressed my back to the opposite wall. The hum grew louder. It wasn't just the walls now. It was beneath the floor, in the furniture, inside me. Every vibration carried something old, patient, and watching. Time lost meaning. The shadows shifted imperceptibly, like water running over stone. The walls pulsed with a hum, each throb a reminder that I was not alone. My skin prickled under it, alive to a presence I couldn't name. I wanted to speak, to say anything, but the air swallowed words. The hum pressed against my throat, leaving only silence. Then a single point of pale light flickered. A reflection? A memory? The shadows recoiled slightly, folding in on themselves. The vibration lessened, settling into faint rhythm of my heartbeat. I stood still, listening to the room breathe. The walls hummed faintly, patient and endless. Shadows rested in corners, waiting. By the time the first hint of morning touched the window, everything seemed ordinary. The walls no longer vibrated. The shadows appeared still, but the hum lingered, low, patient, and secretive, as if the room remembered me, and I had no choice but to remember it. The room smelled of dust and coal plaster. Winter light seeped into the blinds, pale and hesitant. The air was still, heavy, almost waiting for something. I noticed it first in the corner, a line of shadow, unnatural and deep. I blinked, and a doorway had appeared. Where none had been before, there it stood, black and empty. The edges weren't sharp. They shimmered slightly, like heat on pavement, bending the floor and walls around it. The air felt thicker near it, pressing against my chest with quiet insistence. I stepped closer. My fingers brushed the frame, cold and almost liquid, as though the wood had melted into the floor. A pulse ran under my skin in response, a tiny hum that wasn't mine. Inside the doorway, darkness moved, slowly, patiently, a figure, faint and distant, shifting just beyond recognition. I couldn't see a face, only the outline of something watching, waiting. I wanted to step back, but my feet stayed rooted. The hum rose in my chest, echoing the pulse of the dark beyond. Every breath tasted faintly metallic, like iron left in rainwater. The shadows in the room bent toward the doorway. Corners stretched and folded, brushing against walls I knew were empty. It was subtle, almost polite, but impossible to ignore. I whispered to myself, silently, it's not real. It's only a trick of light. But the doorway didn't respond to reason. It exhaled a cold that rolled across the floor, curling around my ankles. And the figure moved again, closer, slow and deliberate, brushing the edge of perception. I reached for the lamp. Its pale light trembled, flickering once, twice, refusing to fully illuminate the darkness. The doorway seemed to drink the glow, folding it into its black. Even the hum from my chest joined it, vibrating in tandem with the pulse beyond. I tried to step around it, to leave the room entirely. The floor stretched beneath me, subtle, liquid. Shadows pressed softly into my legs. I realized that the doorway wasn't just in the room. It was in the walls, the air, the space I occupied. The figure moved closer. No footsteps, no sound. Only the feeling of being observed. Weighed, measured. Its outline blurred and thickened, then thinned again, like smoke through a keyhole. I wanted to turn away, to close my eyes. But some quiet curiosity, quiet terror, kept me in place. It leaned, almost expectant, just inside the frame. I could feel it in my chest, the pulse of the darkness, the hum, the cold, the subtle pressure of air. Everything in the room seemed to bend around it, bowing to its presence. And then stillness. The figure froze. The doorway held its shape, solid and impossible. The hum faded into a quiet thrum, soft as a heartbeat. I backed away slowly. The shadows retreated to the corners. The light from the lamp steadied. By the time morning touched the room, the doorway remained, silent, dark, and waiting. I could feel it even in the empty corners of the room, in the air between my breath and the walls. I left the lamp where it stood. I did not touch the doorway. I did not try to enter. I only listened as the faint pulse of darkness whispered through the room, and I realized that it had always been there. The room smelled faintly of varnish and cold air. Winter had left the windows slightly fogged, leaving streaks of pale light across the floor. I could feel the chill pressing against my ankles, soft and insistent. The floorboards glimmered, not with the lamp's light alone, but with something strange, subtle, flickering under the surface. Reflections that bent and shifted, twisting in ways that my eyes could barely follow. I stepped forward slowly. The glimmers rippled under my feet. Each movement I made caused the light to fold, recoil, as if the floor were breathing beneath me. I could feel the pulse through the soles of my shoes, a faint hum that climbed my legs. Shadows stretched, long, thin, and fluid. Corners that seemed empty now arched and leaned toward the light, bowing impossible angles. When I moved, the shadows responded, receding or bending in ways that mirrored my steps. I knelt to touch the boards. Cold, smooth, almost wet under my fingertips. The glimmer reflected faintly on my skin, dancing over veins and knuckles. It pulsed softly, like the room was alive, breathing beneath the surface. The hum rose slightly, not mechanical, not ordinary. It was a vibration that threaded through the floor, brushing my spine, whispering against the backs of my knees. I looked up. The lamp flickered, but its light didn't explain the reflections. They existed beyond the glow, in the space between shadows and boards, in the breath of the air itself. Movement shimmered at the edge of vision. But when I tried to focus, it dissolved into a glint or a pulse. I took another step. The glimmers shifted faster now. They responded to me, like small living things, playful, cautious. Shadows recoiled slightly, only to stretch again when I froze, waiting. A soft rustling moved across the floorboards. No one else was in the room. I pressed my hand flat against the board. The pulse under my palm thrummed in rhythm with the faint glimmers. I felt weightless and heavy all at once. The air thickened, carrying a faint metallic tang, like distant rain over iron. The shadows danced quietly in corners, bending and curling, watching the glimmering floor with patience. I wanted to reach out to the reflections, to understand the movement, to touch the small living pulse of the boards. But when my fingers hovered over the surface, the light recoiled, folding into itself, leaving only ordinary grain. The room fell quiet. Even the hum softened, retreating to a faint thrum under my chest. Shadows returned to corners, but the glimmers lingered, hidden just beneath the boards. Waiting, I sat on the edge of the bed, watching, breathing. Every glance toward the floor felt like a conversation I couldn't fully understand. By the time dawn stretched pale fingers across the windows, the room seemed calm. The glimmers were faint, barely there, and the shadows appeared normal. Yet I knew they hadn't gone. The floor remembered my steps. The light followed, quiet, patient, and alive. And I understood that I was not merely in the room. I was part of it. The room smelled of dust and old plaster. Winter light pressed faintly through the blinds, pale and hesitant. The air was still, thick with the quiet weight of evening. I noticed the ceiling first. Small cracks, hairline fractures, nothing unusual. But tonight they whispered, soft voices, almost inaudible, brushing the edge of my hearing. I looked up, tracing the lines with my eyes. Shadows flickered along the cracks, stretching and folding in the pale light. They were fleeting, dissolving before I could fully see them, yet I felt their shape, their movement. The hum began, low, vibrating the walls, climbing into the floorboards, pressing against my chest. It resonated with the whispers above, threading through the air with quiet insistence. I could feel it in my temples, a gentle thrum that seemed alive. I moved closer to the bed. Soft footsteps, though no one was there, echoed lightly over the wooden floor. The shadows overhead seemed to lean, bowing toward me in subtle, impossible arcs. Each crack in the ceiling held a different murmur, weaving together into a soft, hypnotic chorus. I pressed my hand to the mattress. The hum responded, climbing through my fingers, a pulse that was almost tactile. I felt the air shift, brushing my face, carrying faint hints of cold stone and damp wood. A shadow formed in the largest crack. It lengthened, twisting slowly, then dissipated into the dark. Movement existed where nothing should, bending the ordinary geometry of the room. My breath caught in my throat, shallow and careful. I tried to follow the whispers. They were fragments, hints of words, syllables too soft to fully understand. They curled in the air, brushing my ears, pressing against the base of my skull. Each time I leaned closer, they pulled away, just beyond comprehension. The hum rose. Now it vibrated in harmony with the whispers, pressing into my chest, my throat, my teeth. I could feel the shadows stretching toward it, leaning along the beams, folding into the cracks. The room itself seemed to breathe in rhythm with the low resonance. I wanted to stand to leave, but my feet stayed still. The ceiling watched, patient and deliberate. The whispers twisted and recoiled, soft, curling around the hum, folding into silence. A single fragment lingered, a word that felt familiar, almost remembered, floating in the vibration. I strained to catch it, but it dissolved, leaving only the hum and the soft, impossible shadows. Time stretched. The winter light faded, leaving the room wrapped in gentle darkness. The cracks whispered faintly. The hum softened to a pulse in my chest. I pressed my palms to my eyes. I could still feel the ceiling above, watching, waiting. The shadows rested in the cracks, patient and silent. By the time morning light crept through the blinds, the room seemed empty. No whispers, no shadows. Only the faint pulse in my chest reminded me that the ceiling remembered. And I knew, even in the calm, that it had not left. The hallway smelled of damp wood and faint smoke. Winter light barely touched the walls, leaving long streaks of gray across the floor. The air was still heavy, as if waiting for a quiet exhale. I saw it first as a shadow, a dark silhouette lingering just beyond the doorway, motionless, not human, but shaped vaguely like one, edges blurred, bending slightly with the dim light. The hum returned, soft, steady, pulsing in rhythm with the figure's presence. It rose through the floorboards, brushed my ribs, settled under my collarbone. I felt it before I saw it fully, a vibration I could not ignore. The shadows along the walls twisted, not from the lamp, not from the faint street light. They bent and curled toward the figure, stretching impossibly long, recoiling slowly. Corners leaned, folding inward, as though the hallway itself was watching. I stepped closer, careful. The floorboards felt alive beneath my feet, responding, pulsing faintly under weight. The air carried the scent of cold stone and dust, brushing against my cheeks, leaving a faint chill in my throat. The figure shifted, almost imperceptibly, a sway, a lean that mirrored my own hesitation. No footsteps, no movement of air, but the hum pulsed faster, brushing through my temples, threading through my chest. It watched without eyes, waiting. I tried to focus on the walls, the floor, anything ordinary, but the shadows clung to the figure, curling in on themselves, stretching along the edges of light. Even the doorway seemed to bend, as though the frame itself bowed toward the shape. I whispered to myself, silently, barely breathing, it's only shadow. It's only the hallway. The silhouette responded, if not intentionally, then as if aware. It shifted closer to the lamp's pale glow, just enough that the edges of shadow stretched along the walls. The hum deepened slightly, vibrating under my knees, up my spine, under my ears. I pressed my back against the wall. Soft footsteps echoed my own, or something else. The figure swayed, leaning toward the dark corners, where shadows pooled and twisted. It did not move as a person would, but it moved. The air thickened, metallic, faint, like rain on rusted metal. Every breath tasted slightly of iron. The hum thrummed in tandem with the figure's subtle sway, rising and falling in quiet rhythm. I wanted to step forward, to see it fully, to know what it was. Curiosity held me, even as unease tightened my chest. The silhouette bent with the shadows, then recoiled, folding almost into the wall. The hum softened, a slow pulse, patient and deliberate. Time stretched, thin and silent. The hallway held its shape, the figure its dark form, bending the ordinary world into something that was not quite real. I sat still, listening, feeling the vibrations, letting the faint chill crawl along my arms. By the time pale morning light touched the far wall, the silhouette remained, silent, patient, bending the shadows. The hum softened to a whisper in my chest, leaving only the quiet rhythm of the hallway. I turned slowly, leaving the doorway behind. The figure lingered, and I knew it would, patient, still, waiting in the folds of shadow, in the soft pulse of the hum, In the quiet corners of the hallway, the room smelled faintly of damp carpet and cold air. The winter light through the window was thin, pale, and hesitant. Every corner seemed slightly darker than it should be. I noticed it first in the far corner. It wasn't still, not fully. It shifted ever so subtly when I wasn't looking directly. Shadows bent along the walls, curling at impossible angles. The floor beneath me felt uneven, though my feet were flat. A soft vibration hummed through the floorboards, almost in rhythm with my heartbeat. I moved slowly. Each step caused the light to flicker sporadically, pale and uncertain. Corners that had seemed ordinary stretched and bowed, bending in ways that made my chest tighten. I pressed my hand against the nearest wall. Cold, dry, solid, yet the shadows along the adjacent corners slid around it, folding in and out, curling against the edges of light. I could feel a slight draft brushing the hairs on my arms, carrying faint hints of rust and rain. I tried to focus. On the lamp, on the floor, but the corners didn't stay. They shifted when my gaze faltered, folding into themselves, then stretching again, patient, deliberate. A low hum rose in the room. Not mechanical, not ordinary. It threaded through the walls, the floor, the air around my ears. It pressed gently against my chest, vibrating in slow, deliberate pulses. I took a step toward the far corner. It recoiled, folding as if aware of my movement. The shadows twisted faster, sharper, reaching along the walls, bending reality subtly, almost politely. I leaned closer, curiosity and fear mingling in my chest. The air grew colder, carrying faint metallic tangs, brushing my cheeks and lips. The flickering light cast corners in fleeting relief, but only for a moment. Then they shifted again, impossibly, silently, waiting. I wanted to move backward, to leave the room entirely, but my legs felt weighted, heavy, soft footsteps echoing though I was alone. The hum pulsed in tandem with the shadows, vibrating under my palms when I pressed them to the floor. The corners weren't corners anymore. They were folds in the room itself, bending space, stretching the ordinary, pressing against the familiar shapes of walls and ceiling. Even the lamp seemed hesitant, flickering in fear, or perhaps in recognition. Time slowed. The flicker became almost a heartbeat, the hum a whisper threading through the air. Every shadow seemed alive, twisting just beyond perception, curling over itself, patient, aware. I sank to the edge of the bed, watching, breathing, feeling the vibration under my skin. The corners shifted once more, and I realized that they remembered me, just as I would remember them. By the first pale light of morning, the room appeared still. The shadows rested. The corners looked ordinary. The lamp held steady. But I knew it was a calm that would not last. The corners would move again. The shadows would twist. And the hum would return, patient, slow, and alive. Waiting for the next moment, I faltered. The room smelled faintly of cold wood and dust. Winter light pressed against the blinds, thin and pale. The air was still heavy, carrying a quiet tension I could feel in my chest. It hovered above the bed, small, unassuming at first, yet impossible. A faint object, levitating silently, defying gravity as though the world had softened beneath it. Shadows bent and warped around it. Corners stretched toward the floating shape, then recoiled. The walls seemed alive, folding subtly in the pale light, as if the room itself watched. A low hum began, melodic, slow, vibrating through the floorboards of my chest. It threaded through the air, brushing my ears, humming against my teeth, soft but insistent. I could feel it in the tips of my fingers when I reached toward the object. I dared to touch the air beneath it. Nothing, yet the sensation lingered, cool, tingling, alive. The object moved slightly, almost in response, hovering with delicate patience, teasing the limits of perception. The shadows twisted further. They stretched unnaturally along the walls, curling toward the object, folding into themselves, leaning in impossible angles. The hum pulsed with each tiny shift, wrapping the room in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. I held my breath. The air carried a faint metallic tang, brushing my lips and the bridge of my nose. The floorboard seemed to soften beneath my feet, alive with the resonance of the hum. Every movement I made was mirrored subtly in the floating object's tiny shifts. Time became elastic, Seconds stretched long, folding into each other. The object floated just out of reach, patient, deliberate. Its presence made the shadows recoil and stretch, weaving along the walls, dancing faintly at the edges of vision. I knelt beside the bed. The hum thrummed in rhythm with my heartbeat, echoing in my chest, my palms, the backs of my knees. The object tilted ever so slightly, responding to my focus, though no physical force guided it. I tried to speak, softly, but the words were swallowed by the hum. Instead, I simply watched. The shadows leaned closer, curling in delicate, impossible folds, wrapping the room in quiet awareness. The object hovered in stillness, melodic hum threading the air, filling the space between walls, floor, and ceiling. I could feel its presence in the weight of the air, in the subtle warmth along my arms. By the first pale light of morning, it drifted slightly closer to the pillow. The shadows relaxed, still warped, still impossible, yet patient. The hum softened to a gentle pulse, like a heartbeat shared between the room and myself. I sat back, feeling the floorboard beneath me, the cool air brushing my skin, the object above the bed, patient and impossible. Even as light filled the windows, I knew it had not left. It waited, patient, silent, and I understood that I would always feel its presence in the quiet corners of the room. The room smelled faintly of cold glass and old wood. Winter light struggled to the blinds, brushing pale lines across the floor. The air felt heavier than usual, as though the room itself was holding its breath. I approached the mirror. At first, it was ordinary, but then nothing. No reflection, only darkness, deep and unbroken, as if the glass had swallowed every trace of me. Shadows rippled across the surface, not in the room, but within the mirror itself, folding and twisting, bending into impossible shapes. The edges seemed to curl inward, and the hum returned, low and resonant, threading through walls and floor. I raised my hand. The darkness remained. No reflection, yet the ripples followed my movement, subtle, deliberate, as if the mirror were aware. I pressed my palm against the frame, cold, smooth, unyielding. The hum deepened, vibrating along my fingers, climbing my arm into my chest. I could feel it in my teeth, faint and insistent, pressing to the rhythm of my heartbeat. The shadows in the room seemed to respond. They leaned toward the mirror, stretching unnaturally, curling around corners, folding in on themselves. Every flicker of light bent around the glass, avoiding it, as if the room recognized its own absence. I whispered softly, but the words were swallowed by the resonance. Even breathing seemed loud against the hum. The darkness in the mirror pulsed, faintly as if alive, reflecting nothing but its own quiet presence. I tried to step back. The floorboard beneath me vibrated faintly, matching the hum's rhythm. The shadows rippled once more, twisting along the walls, folding into themselves, curling toward the mirror as though drawn to it. The air grew colder. A metallic tang brushed my tongue and the tip of my nose, subtle and sharp. I could feel the mirror's presence pressing outward, patient, deliberate, and unmoving. It was not glass, not reflection, but void with weight and awareness. Time became slippery. The hum throbbed slowly, almost melodic, echoing in my chest. The ripples on the mirror slowed, then paused, as if it was holding itself in quiet suspense. The room seemed to bend subtly toward the glass, corners elongating, shadows stretching, awaiting something I could not name. I stepped closer again, curiosity and unease mingling in my chest. The hum matched my heartbeat now, slow, deliberate, intimate. Every glance at the darkness deepened the shadows around it, folding the ordinary into something impossible. I pressed my face near the glass. Cold, smooth, unyielding, the ripples quivered faintly, brushing the edge of perception. No reflection, only darkness, only the hum, only the quiet, patient waiting of the mirror. By the time morning touched the room, the darkness remained. The shadows folded into corners. The hum softened to a low pulse. I could feel the weight of it in the air, pressing against my skin, my chest, my mind. I turned away slowly. The mirror reflected nothing, and I knew it would not forget me. The room smelled faintly of wet asphalt and cold glass. Winter fog pressed against the windows, soft and dense, leaving the street lamp's light fractured and weak. The air was thick, heavy, carrying the quiet weight of anticipation. The street lamp outside flickered. Each pulse of light cast shadows across the walls, long and unnatural. Shapes emerged where none should be, stretching along the corners, bending over furniture, folding into themselves. A low hum began, rising and falling slowly, brushing against my ribs, threading to floorboards, curling in my ears. It pulsed in tandem with the flicker, patient, deliberate, almost sentient. I moved closer to the window. The glass was cold beneath my fingers, fogged with the warmth of my breath. Shadows shifted with every flicker of light, curling around the edges, forming impossible angles that my mind tried to ignore. I pressed my cheek to the glass. The hum deepened, vibrating through the thin pane, brushing my teeth, threading under my scalp. Outside, the street lamp seemed hesitant, as though unsure whether to illuminate the world or leave it in darkness. A shape moved. No source, no footstep, no movement in the air. It leaned along the wall, thin and elongated, stretching toward the window, then recoiling just as the lamp blinked again. The shadows followed it, curling, twisting, patient. I stepped back slowly. The floorboard beneath my feet thrummed with a hum, vibrating faintly through my shoes. The air grew colder, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and iron. Every breath was heavy, shallow, caught between curiosity and unease. The flicker continued. Each pulse revealed something new. Corners bending slightly, shadows folding, shapes that seemed alive just beyond perception. The hum rose slightly, vibrating through the room, brushing the back of my neck, curling around my wrists. I watched frozen. The shapes moved with purpose, responding to the light, to the hum, to my own presence. I felt small, suspended, like a thread in vibration, drawn into the rhythm of flicker and shadow. The street lamp blinked again, briefly illuminating the shapes fully. Edges twisted and folded in impossible geometry, shadows overlapping shadows, bending the room around them. The hum rose and fell, patient, echoing in my chest, resonating beneath the floor. I sank to the edge of the bed, hands pressed to my knees, palms cold against the wood. The shadows shifted quietly, folding in corners, stretching along walls, moving without source. The hum soft and gentle, insistent, wrapping around the room like a slow exhale. By the time morning light crept across the windows, the flicker had ceased. The shapes had receded, leaving ordinary corners and walls. But the hum lingered faintly, a memory pressing the floor, the air, my chest. I exhaled slowly. The room seemed calm, but I knew it was only patience. The shadows would return, the flicker would resume, and the hum would rise once more. Patient, deliberate, and waiting. The room smelled faintly of cold wood and lingering smoke. Winter light slipped weakly through the blinds, pale and hesitant. The air was still, yet heavy, as though carrying the weight of quiet expectation. Soft footsteps echoed across the floorboards. Slow, measured, deliberate. I wasn't moving. The room was empty. Shadows bent toward the sound, stretching along the walls, folding into corners, curling against the edges of light. The hum persisted, low and insistent, threading to the floor, the walls, the air around my ears. I pressed my palms to the bed, cold, rough beneath my fingers. The vibration of the hum pulsed faintly under my hands, climbing my arms into my chest. Every heartbeat matched it, slow, deliberate, patient. I moved toward the center of the room. The steps echoed lightly, as if pacing with me. Yet no one was there. The shadows twisted, stretching toward the invisible source, bending reality along the edges of vision. The hum rose slightly, brushing my teeth, threading under my scalp. I leaned closer to the corner. The floorboards creaked softly beneath my weight. The footsteps paused and resumed, circling, careful, deliberate. The air felt colder here, carrying faint traces of damp stone and rust. I reached out toward the sound. Nothing but empty air, yet the shadows responded, leaning, folding, wrapping around the silent rhythm. The hum vibrated gently, brushing my spine, my chest, settling in my throat. Time became slippery. Each step echoed again, though I could not tell where it began or ended. The shadows twisted along the walls, stretching impossibly, folding over themselves patient. The hum wove around the room, soft, insistent, alive. I sank to the floor, knees pressed to cold boards, palms braced beside me. The footsteps moved closer, circling softly, almost tenderly. I felt them in a vibration under my skin, as much as I heard them in the air. The shadows leaned in, following the invisible presence. They curled along the corners, stretched along walls, pressing against the edges of the room. The hum softened, lingering gently in my chest, a heartbeat shared between me, the empty air and the unseen. I exhaled slowly, holding my breath longer than I should. The room seemed calm, but I knew it only waited. The steps would return, the shadows would bend again, and the hum would persist, low, insistent, patient. By the pale light of morning, the footsteps had gone. The shadows rested quietly, though still impossible. The hum remained faint, a memory vibrating through floorboards, the walls, the air. I rose slowly, brushing cold dust from my palms. The room seemed ordinary, yet I could still feel the soft echo beneath my feet, the patient presence in the shadows, and the quiet insistence of the hum. The room smelled faintly of linen and cold air. Winter light seeped softly through the blinds, pale and hesitant. The floorboards creaked lightly beneath my weight, though I moved slowly, almost afraid to breathe. The curtains swayed. No wind, no draft, just soft movement, fluid and deliberate, brushing against the window frame. Shadows flickered across the walls, folding and curling with each sway. I stepped closer. The fabric moved gently, almost teasingly, yet there was weight to it, deliberate presence. A faint figure was behind the curtains, just a silhouette, pale and indistinct, shifting as the fabric moved over it. The hum persisted, low, insistent, vibrating through the floor of the walls, threading softly in my chest. It seemed to pulse in rhythm with the curtain's sway. The shadows along the edges of the room leaned toward the movement, stretching impossibly. I reached out slowly, fingertips brushing the cool fabric. The figure seemed to recoil slightly, folding into itself. The air carried a faint metallic tang, brushing my nose and lips, sharp against the cold. The sway continued, deliberate, slow, as if the curtain and the figure shared some quiet understanding. I tried to step back. The shadows twisted in response, folding over themselves, creeping along the walls. The hum rose slightly, vibrating faintly under my hands when I pressed them to bed. Every heartbeat seemed to echo it, slow, deliberate, patient. The figure shifted again. A hand? Or just shadow? Impossible to tell. The curtains moved over it like water, flowing, patient, deliberate. I sank to the floor, knees pressing the cold boards. The hum vibrated gently beneath me, brushing my spine, settling in my chest. The shadows curled along the corners, stretching, leaning toward the curtains, pressing against the air. Time slowed. The figure stayed just behind the fabric, patient, barely visible, aware. The swaying continued, gentle, deliberate, a quiet rhythm that filled the room. The air felt thick, carrying faint hints of dust, linen, and something metallic, almost forgotten. I held my breath, listening to the faint sway and the low hum threading the room. Every movement of the curtain seemed purposeful, alive, drawing the shadows, drawing me. I could feel the presence behind it, patient, silent, impossibly near. By the first pale light of morning, the curtain hung still. The figure had receded into shadow, leaving only faint ripples in the fabric. The hum softened, lingering faintly in the air and the floorboards in my chest. I rose slowly, brushing cold dust from my palms. The room seemed ordinary, yet I could still feel the quiet rhythm of the sway, the patient presence behind the fabric, and the low, insistent hum that waited, patient and deliberate, for the next quiet moment. The room smelled faintly of damp wood and aged fabric. Winter light barely reached the corners, pale and hesitant, brushing over the floorboards in thin lines. The air was thick, carrying the quiet weight of anticipation, as though it knew I would come closer. The closet door was ajar. Darkness spilled out like thick ink, pooling at the base, curling along the edges of the frame. Shadows stretched from within, bending unnaturally, leaning against walls, folding into corners. A low hum pulsed beneath it, melodic, slow, deliberate, brushing against my chest, threading to the floorboards, vibrating in the air around my ears. It felt alive, patient, aware. I moved closer, fingertips brushing the cool wood of the doorframe. The darkness recoiled slightly, folding on itself, shadows twisting in response. The hum deepened, vibrating faintly under my palms, climbing my arms, settling in my chest like a heartbeat not my own. I peered inside. Nothing at first. Then the shadows shifted, curling along the walls, stretching toward the door, bending impossibly along the floor. The darkness seemed to pulse with a hum, rising and falling, patient and deliberate. I stepped closer still, toes brushing cold floorboards. The air was colder near the closet, carrying faint scents of dust, old fabric, and something metallic, sharp and lingering. Shadows leaned, stretching further, folding into the air, patient, deliberate, impossible. I pressed my palm to the door. Cold, smooth, unyielding. The hum vibrated through me, brushing my spine, threading through the floor, echoing in the walls. The darkness inside pulsed in rhythm, aware of my presence, waiting. Time became slippery. The shadows twisted, stretched, and recoiled along walls and floorboards. The hum rose slightly, then softened to slow, insistent whisper that filled the room. I felt suspended, small, drawn into the quiet rhythm of pulse and shadow. I leaned closer, holding my breath. A hand? Or merely the trick of light and shadow? Impossible to tell. The darkness seemed alive, patient, deliberate, shifting as I focused. I sank to the floor, knees pressing the cold boards, palms braced beside me. The hum vibrated beneath me, under my skin, threading around my chest and throat. Shadows curled toward the closet, stretching, leaning, following, patient and silent. By the first pale light of morning, the door had shifted slightly, still ajar. The shadows rested quietly, still impossible. The darkness receded into patient waiting. The hum softened, lingering the floorboards, walls, and air, a memory pressing against my chest. I rose slowly, brushing cold dust from my palms. The closet seemed ordinary now, yet I could feel the weight of the darkness, the patient stretch of shadows, and the quiet pulse of the hum, waiting for the next moment, deliberate and patient. The room smelled faintly of old wood and faint candle smoke. Winter light seeped softly through the blinds, brushing the edges of the floorboards in thin, pale lines. The air felt thick, almost tangible, pressing against my skin with quiet insistence. A corner of the room glimmered, soft, faint light, impossible to trace to any source. It shimmered across the walls, spreading and fading, brushing over the floor like liquid. The shadows responded, twisting, writhing, bending along impossible angles. They folded over themselves, stretching toward the glimmer, as though drawn to it, patient and deliberate. I moved closer, feet brushing the cold boards. The air thickened further, carrying faint scents of dust and metal, brushing against my nose and lips. The hum persisted, low and insistent, threading through my chest, vibrating under my palms when I pressed them to the floor. The glimmer shifted slightly as I approached. Reflections folded along the walls, creating shapes that weren't there moments before. Shadows bent and twisted in response, curling along corners, folding into thin lines of light. I sank slowly to the floor, knees pressing the cold boards. The hum pulsed gently, brushing my spine, wrapping around my chest. Every exhale mingled with the movement of the shadows, the slow rhythm of the glimmer, the impossibly thick air. Time stretched. The corner shimmered, folding light across itself, teasing shapes into existence, then dissolving them. The shadows leaned, patient, deliberate, impossibly aware. The air was heavy, almost solid, carrying faint traces of damp stone and linen. I reached toward the glimmer, fingertips brushing the edge of light, brushing nothing but air. The shadows recoiled slightly, then pressed closer again, bending impossibly patient. The hum rose, then softened, threading to floorboards and walls, alive and insistent. I sank lower, palms pressed flat to the floor. The corner shimmered gently, inviting, impossible. The shadows folded along themselves, stretching, twisting, curling into the air, patient, deliberate. The hum softened further, lingering in my chest, threading through the room. The glimmer pulsed faintly, a slow, deliberate rhythm, like a heartbeat shared between light, shadow, and air. I could feel the room waiting, patient, alive, impossible, and still. By the pale light of morning, the glimmer faded, leaving ordinary corners and walls. The shadows rested quietly, folded into themselves, still impossible. The hum remained faint, a memory vibrating through floorboards, walls, and air, patient and insistent. I rose slowly, brushing cold dust from my palms. The room seemed ordinary now, yet I could still feel the impossible presence. The soft pulse of light, the patient shadows, and the impossibly thick air that lingered, waiting, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The room smelled faintly of cold stone and dust. Evening light pressed softly through blinds, pale and hesitant, brushing over floorboards in thin lines. The air felt heavy, thick with quiet expectation, pressing gently against my skin. The shadows whispered, softly, impossibly, like breath carried through the walls. Words I couldn't understand threaded through the air, curling along the edges of the room, brushing my ears and lips. They moved along the walls, folding over themselves, twisting impossibly, climbing the ceiling in fluid arcs. The hum rose, low and melodic, pulsing through the floorboards, threading into my chest. It carried a patient insistence, alive and aware. I stepped closer, toes brushing cold boards. The shadows bent toward me, leaning, patient, deliberate. Every whisper rose and fell with a hum, merging into a rhythm that pressed softly against my skin. The air thickened, carrying faint traces of metal and something older, faintly acrid, brushing my nose. I sank to the floor, palms pressing against the cold wood. The whispers pressed closer, curling into my awareness, patient, impossible to follow. Shapes twisted in the shadows, moving just at the edge of sight, folding over themselves, retreating, returning. I reached toward a wall. The shadows shifted in response, folding, stretching, impossibly aware. The hum rose, melodic and persistent, brushing my chest, threading through my spine, vibrating gently beneath my hands. I could feel the words in the shadows, patient, deliberate, impossible to understand. Time slowed. The shapes bent and twisted along walls and ceiling, patient, deliberate, alive. The whispers rose and fell, threading through the hum, curling along corners, brushing my awareness. The air pressed thickly around me, carrying the scent of old fabric, stone, and something faintly metallic. I pressed my palms harder to the floor, knees cold against the boards. The shadows leaned, patient, impossible, curling into the room, following some rhythm only they understood. The hum pulsed, melodic, threading the room, rising and falling, patient and deliberate. By the first pale light of morning, the shadows had settled, folding along walls and ceiling, impossibly still. The whispers lingered faintly, echoing in the air and floorboards, threading through the quiet. The hum softened, leaving only its memory pressing gently in my chest, patient and impossible. I rose slowly, brushing cold dust from my palms. The room seemed ordinary now, yet I could still feel the weight of presence. The whispers, the melodic hum, the patient, impossible shadows that had moved and breathed along walls, waiting, deliberate, and impossibly near. The room smelled of cold wood and faint smoke, lingering in the corners. Evening light pressed softly through the blinds, thin and hesitant, brushing across the floorboards. The air felt impossibly heavy, like it was pressing against my skin from all sides. The floorboard beneath me seemed to vanish, not completely, but edges blurred, as though the wood melted into shadow. Every step echoed hollow, stretching into the empty space that yawned below. Shadows swirled in the gaps, curling and folding, bending impossibly along walls and floor. They stretched toward me, patient, deliberate, and aware. The hum rose, low and melodic, threading through the boards, through the walls, vibrating in my chest. I moved carefully, toes brushing the cold wood. Each step felt unsteady, like the floor might fold entirely into the dark. The air thickened, carrying faint scent of old stone and dust, brushing my nose and lips with quiet insistence. The shadows shifted with me, folding along edges, twisting into the void that opened beneath each foot. The hum pulsed, rising subtly, a slow crescendo that pressed against my ears, throat, chest. I felt the rhythm of it in my spine, patient, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I sank to the floor, pressing palms flat against the boards. They trembled beneath me, edges blurring into the swirling shadows. I could feel the hum vibrating beneath my hands, threading through the floor, climbing into the walls. The void beneath the boards pulsed softly, shadows curling and folding, patient. The air was impossibly thick, brushing against my cheeks, pressing my chest. Every exhale mingled with the movement of shadow and hum, threading a rhythm I could neither follow nor escape. I reached toward the edge of the disappearing boards. Fingertips brushed empty air, cold and real. The shadows recoiled, then pressed closer, bending impossibly along walls and floor. The hum rose slightly, melodic and insistent, brushing my ears and chest. Threading through the room, time became slippery. The shadows curled impatient, deliberate arcs, following some rhythm only they understood. The boards beneath me shifted imperceptibly, folding into the void, impossibly aware. The hum pressed gently against my chest, rising and falling, insistent, melodic, alive. By the pale light of morning, the floor seemed ordinary again. The shadows rested quietly along walls and boards, impossible, patient. The hum lingered faintly, pressing gently in my chest, a memory of motion, a void of weightless space beneath my feet. I rose slowly, brushing cold dust from my palms. The room seemed ordinary now. Yet I could still feel the presence. The swirling shadows, the invisible void beneath the floor, and the subtle crescendo hum that threaded through it all, patient, deliberate, impossibly alive. The evening pressed gently through the blinds, pale light brushing against the walls. The air smelled faintly of cold paint and old stone. Each breath felt thick, heavy, as though the room itself pressed softly against my chest. The walls, they moved, not quickly, not violently, but with a slow, deliberate ripple, like skin over something living, stretching and folding, patient and aware. Shadows twisted along the rippling surfaces, bending impossibly, stretching toward corners that weren't there moments ago. The hum rose in response, low, melodic, pulsing in harmony with the shifting walls. It vibrated through floorboards, threading along the ceiling, brushing my ears and chest. I pressed my hand against the nearest wall, cold, smooth, yet strangely pliant, as if it yielded slightly under my touch. The shadow near it recoiled, then bent back, patient, deliberate, impossibly aware. Each ripple carried a weight, pressing the air into corners, brushing my skin with faint, unseen currents. The hum grew insistent, threading through my awareness, rising and falling with the slow rhythm of the walls. I could feel the pulse under my palms, beneath my feet, along my spine, patient and deliberate. I stepped slowly, toes brushing the cold boards. Shadows bent in impossible angles around my legs, curling along the walls as they rippled. The air thickened further, faintly metallic, carrying whispers I couldn't understand, brushing my lips and ears. The walls breathed in gentle waves, rising, falling, impossibly alive. The hum threaded along them, weaving with the shadows, a rhythm that pressed gently against my chest. Time felt slippery, stretching and contracting as the surfaces shifted. I sank to the floor, pressing my hands against the boards beneath me. The ripples above stretched and folded in impossible arcs. Shadows twisted and bent, patient and deliberate, waiting. The hum rose and fell, melodic and insistent, threading the room with quiet awareness. By the first pale light of morning, the walls had settled. Shadows rested in corners, impossible, patient. The hum lingered faintly, pressing gently against my chest, echoing the floorboards and along the still surfaces. I rose slowly, brushing dust from my palms. The room seemed ordinary now, yet I could still feel the weight of movement. The impossible stretch of walls, the deliberate bend of shadows, and the soft, melodic pulse of hum that had threaded through it all, alive and patient. The room was quiet, too quiet. The morning light filtered weakly through the blinds, pale and hesitant. The air smelled faintly of dust and cold stone, heavy on my tongue. Then it shifted. A shadow gathered in the far corner, slow, deliberate, folding into itself. The faceless figure returned, still patient and impossibly aware. Shadows leaned toward it, bending at angles that shouldn't exist. They stretched along the walls, curling under the ceiling, brushing my skin with faint, cold awareness. The hum rose again, low and insistent, threading the floorboards, crawling along the ceiling, brushing my chest. I stepped backward, toes grazing the cold boards. The figure didn't move. It simply existed, patient, impossible, its presence folding the air around it. The light shifted. Shadows writhed like liquid, drawn toward the dark corner. Each movement impossible, deliberate, curling in arcs that made the walls seem alive. The hum pulsed in rhythm with their stretch, deep and melodic. I could feel the room breathe, expanding and contracting with the figure's presence. Air thickened around me, carrying faint whispers impossible to decipher. The scent of stone and cold dust pressed in on me, brushing my nose, filling my lungs. The floorboards beneath me seemed to bend slightly, yielding, as if the room itself softened for its presence. Shadows near my feet lifted, curling toward the corner, tracing impossible patterns along the floor. The hum threaded through them all, low and persistent, pulsing in harmony with the figure. I sank slowly to the floor, pressing my palms against the boards. Cold, hard, solid, yet impossibly pliant under my touch. The figure didn't move. It waited patient, drawing the shadows into itself, stretching the room into something unrecognizable. Every blink brought a subtle shift. A corner stretched, a shadow twined into the next. The hum rose a fraction, filling the space with quiet insistence, melodic and alive. I breathed slowly, feeling the weight of presence pressing against my chest. The figure remained faceless, silent, patient, its darkness pressing through every surface of the room. Shadows twisted toward it, air thickened around it. The hum thrummed beneath me. Morning light dulled further, filtered through bending shadows. The room felt impossibly alive, all surfaces folding and pulsing in subtle, deliberate arcs. And yet, the figure didn't move, only existed patient, silent, and impossibly aware. I remained on the floor, hands pressed against the cold boards, listening, feeling the hum in my chest, the whispers along the walls. The shadows curled toward the corner, drawn by something unseen, impossible. The faceless presence lingered, patient, pressing through the room in silence and melodic insistence. Time thinned, stretched between the hum and the bending walls. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. When I opened them, the figure was still there, patient, faceless, and quietly aware, and the shadows leaned ever closer, obedient to an impossible pull. The room was still, too still. The morning light had thinned to pale threads, slipping through blinds like distant fog. I breathed quietly, listening. The air vibrated. A low hum, subtle at first, now threading through every surface. It was beneath the floor, along the walls, curling into my chest with impossible weight. Shadows moved, not cast by light, but living, curling, stretching as if aware. They leaned toward the corner, whispering across the floorboards, brushing my ankles, my skin prickling beneath their silent touch. The figure stirred, not with sound, not with movement I could detect, but closer, closer, patient, deliberate. Its presence pressed into the room, bending the air, twisting the light. I tried to blink it away, tried to steady my breath. The shadows followed. They slid along walls, stretched along the ceiling, curling at angles that made the corners of the room seem to fold in on themselves. The hum rose, subtle, melodic, resonating with the timbre of my heartbeat. Every pulse made the air thicken, warm and heavy on my skin. Dust shifted, floating in slow spirals, caught in a current I could not see. I dared not move. Soft footsteps, mine imagined or real, echoed faintly across boards that seemed to shift under my weight. The figure remained silent, faceless, impossibly near. Shadows coiled, following its pull, obedient to some hidden rhythm. The air vibrated in my ears, humming through bones, brushing nerves I didn't know I had. The figure leaned. No, I leaned toward it. Distance became meaningless. The room a single living pulse of hum and shadow. A faint smell rose, metallic, damp, like wet stone in an empty tunnel. It mingled with the thick air, clinging to my clothes, my hair. I tasted it, bitter, alive, impossibly present. I sank slowly to the floor, pressing palms aboard that felt like liquid beneath skin. The shadows leaned closer. They were almost voices now, murmurs without words, curling around me, brushing cheeks and hands. The hum rose further, melodic, insistent, as if the room itself exhaled in slow rhythm. I felt the weight of presence, not above me, not beside, but everywhere. Every surface pulsed, breathed, folded in gentle, terrifying arcs. The figure moved again, not stepping, not walking, but nearer, its impossibility stretching the air, folding shadows, bending the light. I could feel it, patient, silent, aware. It filled the space between floor and ceiling, walls and boards, reaching me through hum and shadow alike. Time became faint, stretched thin by vibration. Moments folded together, indistinguishable, pulsing with the low, melodic hum. I closed my eyes, and still the air hummed, brushing my skin, curling around my hair, whispering across my cheeks. When I opened them, the room was the same. Shadows still moved. The figure still waited. The air hummed. I could not move. I could not look away. Only feel the presence, impossibly near, impossibly silent. And the hum, low and melodic, threading through everything, through me, until the room and I breathed as one. The evening pressed close. Outside, the sky had lost its last amber glow. The room carried the chill of approaching night, settling into my bones. Light flickered, a fragile thread, then gone. The walls leaned closer, shadows pooling thickly, impossibly dense. I could feel them pressing, heavy against the air, curling toward me with quiet insistence. The hum rose inside my chest, not from the walls, not the floor, inside me. A low, insistent vibration that threaded through every breath, every pulse. I reached for the window. Pale light returned for a heartbeat, then vanished again. Shadows lengthened, spilling across the room like dark water, swallowing corners, edges, the floor beneath my feet. The air thickened. It clung to my skin, heavy, damp, scented faintly of old wood and something metallic. The hum matched its weight, vibrating along my nerves, curling around my spine. I tried to move. Soft footsteps echoed beneath my own, or perhaps beneath the floorboards, shifting unseen. The room responded, shadows bending, folding toward where I had been. A breath of cold swept across my face. Curtains stirred, though no wind moved them. The room's darkness seemed alive, coiling slowly, brushing my hair, my arms, my cheeks. Light returned briefly, pale, trembling, ghost-like. It illuminated the edges of a corner. Shadows writhed, stretching upward, bending with impossible angles. I blinked. It was gone. The hum pulsed louder now. Each heartbeat echoed in unison, pressing through rib and lung, through thought. I could feel it in my teeth, behind my eyes, vibrating along the tips of my fingers as they rested on the floor. The air moved subtly, brushing across my skin. I smelled damp earth, faint decay, the ache of enclosed spaces. The darkness thickened, almost tactile, molding around my shoulders, my chest. I dared not look directly at it. Every glance brought the shadows closer, folding the room in subtle, impossible ways. Corners vanished, reappeared. The hum threaded through it all, weaving the light and dark into one living, breathing pulse. A pause, so brief yet heavy. The silence that followed carried weight, thick and suffocating. And then the hum returned, melodic, insistent, echoing in every space, every nerve. I sank to the floor. The boards beneath me felt unreal, soft yet solid, bending under invisible hands. The shadows leaned, pooling around me, brushing my skin with silent attention. The air shivered in my chest, resonated with the hum, a tether I could not sever. The light flickered again, then vanished. The room was a single, oppressive shadow. The hum wrapped around it all, around me, inside me, until room, shadow, and body were one. I could not see. I could not move. I could only feel the darkness pressing, the hum pulsing, and the faint, impossible knowledge that the light might never return. The room was still, air thick, carrying the faint scent of old wood and damp stone. Even the hum felt pause, hesitant, as if waiting, and then it appeared. A door. glowing faintly, a pale light that trembled along its edges. It had not been there before. I would have sworn of it. Shadows shifted. They leaned toward the light, bending unnaturally, brushing the corners of the room. The hum returned, soft at first, threading along my spine. It grew steadily, curling to the floorboards, rising into the air above my head. I stepped closer. The glow pulsed gently, like a slow heartbeat. Air pressed against my skin, warm and damp. Each breath I drew carried the taste of something metallic, distant yet sharp. The shadows followed. They stretched longer, thinner, whispering along walls and ceiling. It was alive in some way, watching, waiting, bending with intention. Even the room seemed to lean toward it, walls tilting imperceptibly inward. I hesitated. My hand hovered over the surface, fingertips tingling. The hum matched the pulse of the door, rising and falling in subtle rhythm. It vibrated inside my chest, resonating beneath my ribs, along my teeth, through my fingertips. A cold draft brushed my neck. Not from outside, not from the floor. An absence of air, a pull toward the light. The room smelled faintly of charred wood and wet stone, a scent I could not place. I could feel the weight of it, thick as water, pressing into my skin. The door seemed to breathe, edges shimmering, faintly distorting. I could see movement beyond it, shadowed forms that flickered at the corner of my vision. But when I blinked, nothing remained. I leaned closer. The hum became a voice, melodic, insistent, yet not words I could recognize. It hummed around me, inside me, wrapping the room and my chest together. Shadows pulled at my feet, tracing my shape, bending toward the door. I could not stop myself. Step by step, drawn by the glow, the hum, the impossible pull. The air thickened with tension, a heavy, sweet weight that filled my lungs. The floor beneath felt uncertain, softening, bending slightly, as though welcoming me forward. The door pulsed with light. Shadows quivered in response, stretching and recoiling. I could feel it watching, knowing, waiting for the next move. Each breath I drew synced with its glow, each heartbeat with the hum. I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed the surface, the hum surged, melodic and deep. The air seemed to sing, vibrating through every nerve. The shadows swirled around me, forming shapes that were almost figures. Almost, but never quite. A pause, heavy and infinite. The door shimmered brighter for a moment, then dimmed again, as if considering me. The room itself felt suspended, caught between light and shadow, still and trembling. I could not turn away, nor could I step through, only stand, hand hovering, shadows curling, hum singing, and the door waiting, endlessly shimmering. The room felt heavier than air. Even the faint light seemed thick, pressing against my eyes. The hum, it had grown louder, resonant, vibrating to the floor beneath my feet. Shadows moved differently now. They lifted, peeling from walls and floorboards, hovering like smoke trapped in glass. They drifted slowly, almost gentle, yet with intent. I could sense it first. A presence, quiet but impossible to ignore. The faceless figure moved among them, gliding without sound. Its outline was vague, shifting with every pulse of the hum. The shadows bent toward it, curling, stretching, forming impossible angles that pressed against my vision. Even the air smelled different, faintly metallic, mixed with the scent of damp earth and something burnt. Far away, I stepped forward. The floorboards beneath me hummed in response, soft vibrations crawling up my ankles. Each shadowed tendril seemed aware, recoiling, then returning closer, swirling like water around stone. The figure paused. I thought I felt its attention, though I could not see its face. The room stilled, but the shadows kept moving, folding in midair, forming shapes that teased the edge of recognition. Almost hands, almost wings, then nothing again. The hum became melodic, not a song, but a cadence, threading through my bones and rattling my teeth. It pulled at my thoughts, soft and insistent, as if it knew the rhythm of my pulse. I could feel the temperature shift. Cool drafts wrapped around my ankles, brushing my skin, while the faint glow from the far corner made my eyes water. The figure drifted closer, and shadows swirled around it like smoke caught in a silent wind. I wanted to step back, but my body seemed glued in place. Breath shallow, heart hammering, the hum like a tether, binding me to the room and its impossible gravity. Shadows floated higher. They moved against the ceiling, curling and uncoiling like dark ribbons. I could sense their weight, like pressing on my chest, like a quiet pressure that whispered, "Watch, stay, understand, maybe not." The faceless figure passed near me. The air shimmered around it, subtle and unreal, like heat waves rising from cracked pavement in the middle of night. I smelled something sweet, almost decayed, trailing in its wake. I blinked. The shadows seemed to shift faster, responding to the faint movement of my eyes. They weren't just following light or the figure. They were aware of me, bending and lifting in response to my presence. The hum intensified, now a low melodic thrum that filled the room entirely. It pressed into my chest, vibrated my ribs, curling around my spine. The figure moved among the floating shadows, drifting from corner to corner, never stopping. I could not move, could not turn, could not look away. The shadows danced closer. They hovered midair, writhing softly, and the figure glided between them, perfectly silent, perfectly still. I felt the hum in my throat, in my ears, in my fingertips, as though it wanted to speak to me without words. And then the edges of the room softened. Shadows blurred into one another. The figure remained, faceless and calm, while the hum echoed, lingering in the hollow between heartbeat and breath. I stayed frozen, alone with hovering darkness, melodic hum, and the impossible presence. The air tasted heavy, thick, electric. The shadows waited. The figure watched. And I could only breathe, shallow and trembling, as the room held its secret, and the floating shadows drifted silently around me. The room had changed. Or maybe I had. Every corner pressed closer, shadows curling around the edges of my vision. A low hum vibrated beneath my feet, rising steadily, filling the space like liquid metal. It wrapped around my chest, and I felt it in my throat, in the small hairs on my arms. The air tasted thick, metallic, and heavy with something I couldn't name. Whispers began, soft, unintelligible, coming from everywhere at once, from the corners, the ceiling, under floorboards. They brushed my ears, trailing down my neck, curling into my hair. I wanted to step back, but the floor felt uneven, impossible beneath me. Shadows moved differently now, not just along walls. They reached for me, bending and folding like smoke and water. They brushed my skin, cold and damp, leaving a faint, static chill that crawled up my spine. I could sense the figure, still faceless, still gliding silently among the floating shadows. Its presence was closer, impossible to ignore, and hummed pulse in perfect rhythm of my own heartbeat. I tried to breathe. The whispers grew louder, melodic in a way that pressed against my thoughts. They didn't speak words I could understand. Not yet, but they carried intention, direction. The shadows thickened, wrapping around my legs, my arms, a soft weight that seemed almost alive. I shivered. The hum rose to a low, resonant climax. It filled my ears, my chest, my bones. I felt the vibrations in my teeth, in the tips of my fingers. The whispers came closer. They circled me, flowing from wall to wall, ceiling to floor. I wanted to close my eyes, but the shadows would still move, curling toward me, folding into my vision even when I couldn't see them. The figure paused near the center of the room. Shadows gathered around it, rising in slow spirals. It tilted slightly, as if observing me, and I felt every movement, though nothing touched me. The hum and whispers blended, becoming a single resonance that pressed on my mind. The air grew thick. Every breath was heavy, wet, and impossible. I could almost taste the shadows. Earthy, cold, metallic. They wrapped my senses like silk and steel at once. I wanted to speak, to cry out, but no sound would leave me. The whispers were everywhere, now almost comforting in their insistence, pulling me into the room, into the figure, into the floating shadows. Time shifted. The hum reached its peak. My chest felt full of vibration, my ears ringing with every note, every sigh of the whispering dark. The figure tilted closer, and the shadows bent tighter around it, around me. I felt a pull, soft but irresistible, as if the room itself inhaled, and I was part of it. And then silence, not empty, but full, The hum stopped, leaving a low resonance at the center of my chest. The shadows lingered, coiled and calm. The whispers fell to the edge of hearing, soft and patient, like a question waiting for me to answer. I could breathe again. The figure remained, faceless and still. Shadows moved only with the slightest ripple. The air was heavy, yet still. The final whisper lingered, not leaving, not gone, and I was left alone with it. Alone, yet not. The hum had quieted. The shadows folded into corners, and the room waited, waiting for the next breath. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't sure I had ever closed them. The dream felt the same as this. The same deep blue darkness. The same silence, pressing down on my chest. And the same shadows waiting in the corners of the room. They were thicker than they should be, refusing to fade even as I stared. I didn't turn on the lamp. The light from the street lamp outside was enough. It cast a pale, sickly glow across the floorboards, a path of washed-out gold, leading to my bedroom door. It was closed. I always sleep with it open. A chill settled on my skin. Not a sudden cold, but a slow seep, like dampness from old stone. I pulled the blanket tighter. Its rough fabric scratched my chin. The house was quiet, too quiet. No creak of settling wood. No rustle of the old oak tree outside the window. Just a hollow emptiness, a held breath, and underneath it all, the hum, a low, steady vibration. So deep I felt it more than heard it. In my teeth, in my bones. It had been there for weeks now. A patient, unyielding presence. A constant companion in the stillness. I used to search for its source. Tracing electrical wires. Checking the old furnace in the basement. Placing my hands against the walls. Feeling for a tremor. But I found nothing. Just the endless, gentle thrum. It was part of the house now. Part of me. I looked at the shadows in the corner again. They seemed to pulse, softly, in time with the hum. One of them shifted. Not a lot, just a deepening of the dark. A subtle leaning away from the wall. My breath caught in my throat. A dry, papery sound. I didn't move. I didn't want to. There was no fear left. That was the strangest part. The panic had burned itself out days ago. All that remained was a quiet, heavy acceptance. I was not alone here. I had never been alone. The presence was just making itself known. The shadow in the corner coalesced. It took on a shape. Not a monster. Not a person. Just a density. A concentration of the dark. It stood at the edge of the lamplight's path. And it watched me. I could feel its gaze. A pressure against my skin. Like a gentle hand resting on my forehead. I didn't speak. It didn't speak. We just existed together in the blue dark. The hum seemed to soften, becoming a quiet, soothing resonance. It filled the hollow spaces in the room. In me, I thought about getting up, about walking to the door, but my body felt heavy, anchored to the bed. The thought drifted away, unimportant. This was where I was supposed to be. This was how it was supposed to end. Not with a scream, but with a sigh. The presence drifted closer. It didn't walk. It had no legs, no form to move. It simply was nearer. The air grew cooler. I could smell it now. A scent of old books, of dust and forgotten things. And something else, faint and sweet, like dried flowers. It stood beside the bed, a pillar of silent, patient dark. I looked up into it. There were no eyes to meet, just an endless, quiet depth. I closed my own eyes. The hum was inside my head now, a gentle static, washing everything else away. The weight of the blanket, the chill of the air, the worry, the loneliness, all of it began to fade, distant like a radio station losing its signal. The last thing I felt was a profound and final stillness. The last thing I heard was not a sound at all, but the absence of my own breath, and the soft, welcoming silence that rushed in to take its place.